Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. First up on our list of historical highlights for the week is the founding of Harvard College. The Puritans in the Massachusetts colony understood the need to train ministers for the preaching of the gospel in their new colony. On September 8, 1636, they founded Harvard College, named for a prominent English minister who came to America to lead the school. The founders took John 17:3 from the Geneva Bible as their guiding verse. It reads, quote, "And this is life eternal, that they know thee to be the only very God, and whom thou hast sent, Jesus Christ," end quote. Next up on our list of historical highlights is the renaming of the collegiate school at New Haven, Connecticut. A group of Congregationalists felt that Harvard had strayed too far from teaching Calvinism, so they started the collegiate school in 1701. On September 10, 1718, the Congregationalists changed the name of their divinity school to Yale. Last up on our list of historical highlights for the week, and the subject of our deep dive, is the completion of Handel's Messiah on September 14, 1741. George Frideric Handel completed his best-known work in just 24 days. Having already suffered a stroke when he began, Handel credited his creation of an almost error-free 259-page manuscript to drinking a lot of coffee. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Michael Marrisen about the completion of Handel's Messiah.
Hello and welcome back again to another episode of This Week in Christian History. Our focus for this episode that is launched for September the 8th, we're focusing in on September the 14th, 1741, which may or may not be exactly dependent on what everybody looks into, as we've been kicking around a little bit, which is the marking of the completion of one of the most recognized pieces of music, probably period, and then not in addition to that, certainly within church music, which is Handel's Messiah being completed. So Dr. Michael Marissen is with us here. He's the Emeritus Professor of Music at Swarthmore and is joining us for some conversation this morning. So hello, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So do you think that's too much of a statement to say that this is probably some of the most recognized music in both in and outside a church setting?
Well, it's certainly one of the most well-known Christian religious pieces of music, but strictly speaking, it wasn't written for the church. Of course, it was written as during the Lent in Handel's day, the theaters were closed down. So opera couldn't be performed then, and plays couldn't be put on, but oratorios could. So Handel's oratorios were designed for theater going public during the time that theater otherwise wouldn't be offering things. And the additional thing that factors in on this for Messiah is that you can't depict Jesus as a character in theatrical productions even then. So that's part of the reason why the libretto has everything in sort of indirect discourse, and it's not really a narrative. It's a juxtaposition of various biblical texts that sort of follow a pattern that tell you about salvation and so on, but aren't really an actual depiction of a story.
How about that? So when you use the word libretto, okay, is that kind of a common way to say that those are the words and not the music, or is that?
Exactly, yeah, because the librettist, the one who put the words together for Messiah, ordinarily a librettist would write metrical, accented rhyming poetry that the composer then would set to music. But Messiah and also Israel and Egypt of Handel, they're compilations of verbatim, or mostly verbatim. We can come back to that. There's some subtle changes to the words, but they're essentially quotations from the Old Testament and New Testament juxtaposed next to each other. And so what the librettist for Messiah did was very carefully choose a whole series of texts largely from the Psalms and Prophets, and especially ones that were quoted or alluded to strongly in the New Testament that touch on the issue of Jesus being God's anointed one. And those words would then be printed up in a little booklet, and you could buy that booklet and take it. You could study it afterwards and beforehand if you wanted to, but and you could follow along if you wanted to in the performances. And a bunch of those survive from the 18th century, but there's one copy of the 1743 performance in London, and that's here in New York at the Morgan Library. And that's the one printed booklet that's considered to be the one that was authorized by the librettist Charles Jennens himself. Very interesting character, whom we may want to say more about. So that's what the libretto is, and that's what Handel would have had. He didn't use the printed one, obviously. He had a handwritten one, but that's where the words come from that Handel ends up setting to music. That's the idea.
So for this particular for the Messiah, and maybe for others too, it usually starts with the librettist coming up with the language, the whatever it is that might be printed, and then the composer then matches to that. That's right. Is that kind of the typical way it worked, or is it just?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that way. Yeah, sometimes the composer just finds the libretto some way or another and decides to set it to music. Sometimes the librettist is hired. Both the composer and the librettist are hired by the patron. In this particular case, Jennens was a big admirer of Handel's, and he put the libretto together and then tried to convince Handel to set it, and which he did eventually do. And there were some aspects of it that Jennens wasn't happy about. That's kind of interesting too. We may have occasion to talk about that.
Well, let's do, yeah.
But in this particular case, it's because the librettist Jennens had a very strong, particular kind of Protestant agenda that he wanted to push in England, and he thought it would be much more powerful if it were set to music by the greatest composer in England, whom he admired tremendously, Handel. And I mean, they did a great job. I mean, that's why we're still singing and listening. It's absolutely fantastic what they came up with.
Well, did they collaborate like that? I mean, did it go back and forth, or did Jennens understand, hey, it's not my wheelhouse to do the music. Okay, I just kind of know what we want to be able to project, or let's twist the words around a little bit. That's not flowing very well in the way that I'm doing the composing, or is that?
That's great that you should bring that up, because as it happens, usually the composer doesn't collaborate with the librettist in the way that you're describing, but there's a little bit of that in this one, because there were a couple of movements like when a psalm text needs to be set to music to the words, their sound has gone out, talking about the early apostles going out to spread the gospel. Handel initially set that as just a very simple, short, half a minute thing for just a sort of matter-of-fact recitation for a solo singer with a little bit of chordal accompaniment. And Jennens was very disappointed with that. He says, we need a rousing chorus for setting that. And so now in modern performances of it, you almost never hear the original conception of it. The revised musical version by Handel is the one that's always, and it's fantastic. That's the one that's always performed, or usually performed. And that wasn't Handel himself sort of saying, oh, I need to jazz this up a bit. That was at the librettist's instigation. So I think that's quite, that sort of thing is quite interesting, and that will affect, that affects the setup. That's at the very beginning of the lead up to the Hallelujah chorus, which is of course the great moment for most people in listening to Messiah.
Right. So who was two questions kind of came to mind. How famous was Handel at the time that he was approached about trying to write the music? I mean, he's obviously super well-known.
Certainly famous among the music-loving public. It's that's a little bit complicated too, because the operas and the oratorios were mostly performed, as I say, at a theater time when the tickets are quite expensive. So they're mainly for fairly wealthy people to go attend. But there were also many, particularly with Messiah, there started a tradition already of performing it as a charity thing for Foundling Hospital and things like that, and those could have larger audiences of a wider. I mean, often charities are also disproportionately represented by people who are wealthy because you want them to give money to the charity, of course. But it's not as if it was like pop music in the sense that there were large numbers of people going to these things. But he was definitely the great composer of England. They thought he did get English citizenship, but they thought of him, and English people in England today are sort of sensitive about this too. They think of him as an English composer, even though he was born in Germany and spoke English with a very, very heavy accent. And
well, they'd have a queen not too long after that that would do the same thing, right? So it's not that it shouldn't be that. So who was the patron that commissioned this? Is that what it was? It a commissioning of that?
Oh no, for Messiah, Messiah was started as a project by Jennens himself, who was an extremely wealthy gentleman who had a huge personal library of theological books and classics and so on. And he's a very interesting character because, for example, and this is directly relevant, he was the first person to make scholarly editions of Shakespeare in which you provide all the variant readings in the margins. And their view in those days was that you don't try to figure out what the most original reading was, or what, that is to say, the earliest reading or the latest reading, but it was good to have all the different readings that were available from all the historical sources so that you could decide which ones were best for your purposes.
Okay.
And that's exactly what he did with Messiah too, by the way, because a lot of people don't realize that the wording of the King James Bible is not completely identical to the way the words appear in these scriptural quotations in Messiah.
Sure.
Subtle differences here and there. And I tracked down all those subtle differences in the book that I wrote on Messiah. And they can pretty much all be found in these scholarly reference works that were known to have been in Jennens's library. And so what he did too is he obviously looked up all these biblical texts to see what other people, how they thought, they could have been better translated in some cases than they were in the King James Bible. So so some of the slight changes in wording come from that. And then what's also interesting, sort of as a side footnote here, and I don't think this is too academic, it's just kind of a cool human interest thing.
Sure.
There are a couple of places where Handel actually wrote in his score wording that's slightly different from what Jennens provided him with. And I don't think he did that deliberately, and people have been mystified by this in the past, but since I'm an expert on Bach and Bach's setting of librettos that are heavily dependent on making allusions and quotations from the Luther's extremely tendentious translation of the Bible, I recognize right away that in the famous thing like, for he is lowly of heart, is what we all know from Messiah. And so people are puzzled if they actually bother to look at their King James, and it actually says he is lowly in heart. It's not a big difference in meaning, but the question is how would that come about? And I said, well, it's very simple. I mean, Handel's thinking in German, and that passage is in the Luther Bible, reads, ist demütig von Herzen, and von is the word for of. And so he just unconsciously substitutes the word of for in because he's thinking in German. And I think that's kind of interesting. It shows that it speaks to the issue of whether Handel was actually cognizant of the biblical text. Because some people say, oh, Handel just likes to write beautiful music and he didn't care about what, text is text, who cares, as long as it's arousing emotionally. It doesn't matter what the words say. But Handel seems to have been quite sensitive to the words as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So they were obviously both solidly Protestant, or were they Roman Catholic, or they were Protestant?
Oh no, definitely very Protestant. Handel himself was Lutheran, of course, but Jennens was a so-called non-jurist member of the Church of England. That is to say, he had made an oath, like everyone else, to honor the monarchy, which was Catholic at the time that he did that. And the long story, but the British substituted to put it mildly, a Protestant ruler for their Catholic one. And Jennens, even though he was anti-Catholic in the sense that he disagreed with Catholicism, he thought you make an oath is an oath. And so he refused to abjure that. And so as a consequence, he was not allowed to become a professor or become a judge or anything like that. So he was basically an amateur scholar. No one could tell him you can't write librettos or you can't study your books in the privacy of your wealthy estate and so on. So he spent his time going to concerts and reading biblical commentaries and reading Virgil commentaries and so on and so forth. Very, very interesting character. But so that what motivated him to make a libretto that we now call, or that he called Messiah in the piece that we're talking about, is that he was very upset about the way that deism was catching on in England at the beginning of in the 18th century. And what deism essentially is, as you probably know, is the notion that God may very well be the creator of the cosmos and so on. But the understanding is that God created it and then set it in motion and then just sort of was hands off. The metaphor that's often used is like someone who makes a clock and winds it up and just lets it go.
Lets it go, right.
And Jennens was horrified by this because he understood perfectly well that if that were true, then there's absolutely no need for Jesus. And that if it's true that God doesn't intervene in history, then Jesus was not an instance of God's intervening in history. And so essentially Christianity completely falls apart if this catches on. And so he was smart enough to realize, I mean, hundreds of other theologians and scholars wrote books about, Jesus, he was the Messiah, and it's really important that, and he had a lot of those books in his library, but he thought it'd be much more effective to get that message across by just giving you the Bible texts, setting them next to each other, the prophecy fulfillment stuff, and set them to really great music. Because the thing about great music is that, and I don't mean this in there's nothing dissembling about it. The thing is that music is extremely powerful. And so the function of Handel's musical setting is to make the truth of what's being said all the more emotionally palpable, and not to trick you, but to sort of make you feel better about it, as it were.
Sure. If I had to just sit down and read the text, that's one thing. If I'm listening to the text as the same time that I'm reading it and hearing it at the same time, it's a different plane, right?
Well, especially if it's got trumpets and drums and over the top, just build-ups. I mean, it's just fantastic, And so a lot of people love the music now because who don't care about what Jennens's agenda was, or don't care in any way about what the words are about, but they still find thrilling the emotional experience of hearing a performance.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Michael Marissen on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College, in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook at the Center for Christian History, and on Instagram at Christ Hist Today. That's ChristHistToday. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.